Jackson Vitale ran the largest crime family in Chicago, and in his world, a wife wasn't something a man fell into, she was something he selected, the way he'd select a lawyer, or a lock for his front door. So when his mother filled the dining room of the Vitale estate with the 3 most eligible women in the city, everybody in that house already knew how the night was supposed to end. Sienna Barone had a shipping empire behind her name. Whitney Ashworth had built her own fortune before she turned 30. Natalia Lindqvist had played concert halls in Vienna. 3 beautiful, brilliant women, and every single one of them had come to win. And then there was the girl refilling their wine glasses. Brooklyn Novak was 27. She cleaned hotel rooms for a living, and she owed a hospital more money than she'd make in 5 years. Nobody at that table could have told you her name. Nobody looked at her twice. But when she came around the head of the table, she did one small thing, something so quiet that not a single person in that room caught it. And the most dangerous man in Chicago, a man who hadn't shown surprise in 15 years, went completely still, because whatever she'd just done, it meant she knew something about him that only 2 other people on this earth had ever known, and one of them was already in the ground. If this story's pulling you in already, go ahead and hit that like button, it helps more than you know. Share it with somebody who believes the quiet ones are always underestimated. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that dining room. And the moment everything changed, Jackson Vitale sat at the head of the table with his back to the wall, and his right side turned toward the windows, the way he had sat at every table for 15 years. And in all that time, not one person had ever thought to ask him why. Sienna Barone took the chair on his right before the first course came out, and there was no way to ask her to move that wouldn't have required an explanation, so he let it go. She was a talker. That was fine. Most people were talkers. The trouble was the way she did it. Leaning in close with one hand resting on the table between them, her voice pitched low and warm and confidential, the way a woman talks when she wants a man to understand that he has been chosen. Every word she said went into his right ear and died there. So he watched her mouth instead, because he had gotten very good at that over the years. And a man can pull half a conversation off another person's lips if the light is decent and they don't cover their face when they laugh. Sienna covered her face when she laughed. And my father told me absolutely not. So I said to him, she began, and then she broke off, laughing behind her hand, and when she lowered it, she was looking straight at him, waiting. Jackson nodded. Whatever she had said, the nod must have been the right answer, because she laughed again and touched his sleeve and kept going. And halfway down the table, his mother's face opened like a door. That was one. The second came maybe 10 minutes later, and the third somewhere after that, 3 separate times when he nodded at a woman he couldn't hear, and 3 separate times the room read it as interest. Whitney Ashworth sat across from him and slightly to the left, which should have made things easier and didn't. She talked in numbers. She talked fast, and she started the next sentence before she had finished the last one, so the words came out stacked on top of each other like plates in a cupboard. He caught the Lakeview parcel. He caught 11%. He caught a long stretch about zoning that came apart in the middle and never put itself back together. So what do you think? She asked. I think it depends on who's holding the paper, he said, which was the kind of answer that fit almost any question about money, and he had been using it for years. Whitney smiled. She believed she had been engaged with, and that was the whole trick of it, because people never needed him to hear them. They only needed him to seem as though he had. Julian Vitale sat 4 chairs down on the right side of the table, and he had been sitting on Jackson's right since the 2 of them were boys, the way a man always takes the same seat in a car without ever deciding to. Jackson had noticed it once or twice the way a person notices which side of the bed he sleeps on, which is to say he had never really noticed it at all. Halfway through the meal, Julian leaned toward Enzo Baroni and said something against the old man's ear, and Barone didn't laugh. He nodded once, slowly, and then both of them looked down the length of the table at Vivienne. Jackson saw it. He simply couldn't hear it. It didn't concern him. Julian talked to everybody. By the second hour, there was a thin wire of pain running up behind his right temple, the way it always started, and it came from the work, from the constant unbroken labor of watching mouths and filling in gaps and guessing, and then covering the guess, and then covering the cover. He had once gone 11 hours in a room in Cicero doing nothing else. He had thrown up in the car afterward and told his driver it was the food. Then his mother stood. Natalia has agreed to play for us, Vivienne said, and she said it the way she said everything, as though it had already been decided somewhere above the room. Natalia Lindqvist rose and lifted her violin and gave them all a small nod, And then she began the 24th caprice. She played it beautifully. He was certain of that. He was also certain that his grandfather had built this room out of stone, because stone makes a house feel permanent, and the sound had nowhere at all to go. It came off the walls and off the tall windows and off the whole length of the table, and arrived at him all at once, from everywhere and from nowhere. One solid mass with no direction inside it. That was the part nobody understood. It was never about volume. He could take volume. What he had lost was the ability to place a sound, to reach into a room and pull one voice out from under the noise sitting on top of it. And so, in a quiet room, he was an ordinary man, and in a loud one he was blind. He laid his hand flat on the table and left it there until she was finished. The applause came, and his mother turned to him with her chin lifted, and every face at that table turned with her. "That's a difficult piece," Jackson said, which was true, and which was safe. And Natalia flushed with pleasure, and Vivienne settled back into her chair like a woman closing a ledger she was satisfied with. He looked at his watch. 2 hours and 40 minutes gone. The coffee hadn't come out yet, which meant another 40 minutes at the table. And then the standing part, which was always worse. 6 conversations happening at once in an open room, with everyone moving and nobody's face where he could see it. Call it another hour. He could hold an hour. He had counted time this way before, in rooms far worse than this one, and he had learned that the trick was never to look at the whole of it. You took it in pieces. 40 minutes, then an hour, then the front door. Behind him, someone was working her way down the table with a bottle, filling the glasses one by one, and he didn't turn around, because there was no reason on earth to turn around. She had been watching him for an hour and a half, not the way the other women in that room were watching him, and not the way his own mother watched him either, which was a kind of watching that saw only what it had already decided to see. Brooklyn Novak had spent 9 years carrying trays through rooms full of people who never once looked up at her, and a person learns things in that position that nobody at the table will ever learn. She had learned, for instance, that a man who is bored leans back, and a man who is trapped leans forward. She had learned that when someone laughs a half-second late, it isn't because the joke was slow. And she had watched Jackson Vitale turn his head a fraction to the left every single time a person spoke to him. And she had watched him nod at a woman whose words he plainly hadn't received, and she had watched his whole face go smooth and empty when the violin started, the particular emptiness of a man waiting out a storm indoors. Her mother had made that same face for the last 3 years of her life, so when she reached the head of the table with the bottle, Brooklyn didn't come at him from the right the way every other server in that house had been trained to. She stepped around to his left instead, and she bent lower than she needed to, and instead of raising her voice above the room, she dropped it, low and close and even, and she said, "For you, sir." Jackson Vitale went perfectly still. It was not a large motion, that stillness, and nobody in that room saw it happen, but something inside his chest had stopped the way an engine stops when a hand pulls the wire, because there had been exactly 2 other people on this earth who had ever known which side to stand on. One of them was Elias Roth, who had been in the room the night the surgeon said the word permanent. The other was the surgeon, and the surgeon had been dead for 9 years. He didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the wine going into the glass, and when he spoke very quietly, under the noise of the room, in a voice pitched for one person only. "How long have you been doing that?" Brooklyn didn't stop pouring. Her hand was steady, which surprised her later when she thought about it. 3 events before this one, sir." "Who told you?" "Nobody told me." She set the bottle upright against her hip. "My mother was the same. Left side. The last 3 years. You get used to walking around a person." Jackson turned his head then, and he looked at her fully for the first time, and what he found was a face he was certain he had never seen before, which was itself a kind of answer, and not a good one. 9 years he had spent building a life in which no one could ever stand behind him and know. He had rearranged tables. He had rearranged cars. He had ended a partnership over a seating chart and told the man it was about money, and a woman he could not have picked out of a room of 4 had read the whole thing off him in 90 minutes with a bottle in her hand. She gave him a small nod, the way staff do, and she turned to go. He caught her wrist. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't cruel. It was the same motion a man makes when he reaches out and shuts a door that has come open in a house where the doors are supposed to stay closed. His grip settled just above her hand and stopped there, and Brooklyn stood absolutely still, and the bottle hung at her side, and neither of them said anything at all. Natalia Lindquist had begun a second piece somewhere in the last minute. She stopped it now, mid-note, the bow lifting off the string with an ugly little scrape, because she had looked up and seen the head of the table, and understood that whatever was happening there had nothing to do with her. The talk went out of the room in stages, the way lights go out in a building at the end of a shift, table by table, until there was nothing left in it but the sound of a chair leg and someone's fork touching a plate. 22 people looked at the head of the table and saw a serving girl with a bottle and a man holding her wrist. Jackson stood up. He did not let go of her. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, and his voice carried, because for the first time in 3 hours, he wasn't competing with anything. "My mother has gone to a great deal of trouble, and I don't want anyone leaving here thinking their evening was wasted. But we're finished with the part of it where I make a choice." He looked down the table, and he took his time about it. And then he looked at the woman standing beside him, whose name he did not yet know. "This is the woman I'm going to marry." Vivienne Vitali's face went white to the lips. Sienna Barone let out one short laugh, sharp and disbelieving. The laugh of a woman certain she is watching a joke land badly. Whitney Ashworth said nothing, but she set her glass down and moved it 2 inches to the side. And behind her eyes something began quietly rearranging itself, the way it did whenever the price of a thing changed in front of her. And 4 chairs down on the right, Julian Vitali narrowed his eyes, just slightly, and did not look at Jackson at all. He looked at the girl. They took her through a door at the back of the house, and down a hallway she had walked 6 or 7 times that night carrying dishes. And it was strange how different a hallway becomes when you are not the one carrying anything. The study was at the end of it. A man was already inside. An older man with a plain face and reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, sitting in a chair off to the side with a leather folder closed on his knee. He looked up when she came in, and he looked at her for a good while, longer than was polite, and then he opened the folder and took out a pen and said nothing at all. Jackson shut the door. "Sit down." Brooklyn sat. She still had the bottle. She had carried it the whole way without realizing, and now she set it on the floor beside her chair because there was nowhere else to put it, and the small, ordinary sound of glass on wood was the loudest thing in the room. Jackson didn't sit. He stood by the desk, with his weight on one leg, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a lock he has just discovered was never fastened. "This is Elias Roth," he said. "He's been with my family since before I could walk. Anything said in here, he hears. That's the arrangement." Brooklyn nodded. "What's your name?" "Brooklyn Novak." "Where do you work when you're not carrying a tray?" "The Beaumont, downtown. Housekeeping. 14th floor mostly." Elias wrote something. Jackson took a breath and let it out slowly. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, and Brooklyn understood that everything before this had been the polite part. "Miss Novak, I want you to listen to me carefully, because I'm going to say this once, and I'm not going to dress it up. You know a thing about me that could get me killed. Not embarrassed, not laughed at. Killed. There are men in this city who have spent 11 years looking for exactly what you found in 90 minutes with a bottle in your hand. And if they knew what you know tonight, they'd know which side of a room to come from." He let that sit. "So, I have 2 choices in front of me. One of them is that you disappear, and the other is that I tie you to me so tightly that what happens to me happens to you. I would rather not do the first one, but I want you to understand that it's on the table, and I want you to understand that I'm the only person in this house who's keeping it off." Brooklyn's hands were folded in her lap. They stayed there. She had thought, walking down the hallway, that she might be sick, and she was surprised to find she wasn't. There was a strange clarity in it, the way there had been clarity in the hospital corridors that last year, when the worst thing had finally stopped being a possibility and become a fact. "The second one," she said. "What does that look like?" Elias turned a page. "Legal marriage," Jackson said. "Real license, real ceremony, real signatures. 18 months minimum. After that we talk. You sign a non-disclosure agreement tonight before you leave this room. You live in my house. You go where security says you go." He paused. "And your debt goes away. All of it. The $187,000 to Northwestern, the collection accounts, the judgment they filed in March. Gone by Friday. And it stays gone whatever happens between you and me afterward." Brooklyn looked up at that. It had taken them a matter of hours to find out about the debt. She thought about the phone that rang 11 times a day, and about the envelope in her kitchen drawer marked September, and she found that she felt almost nothing about it, which frightened her more than the rest. "There'll also be an allowance," Jackson said. "Monthly. Elias will set the figure." "No." The word came out flat and quiet, and both men looked up. The debt. Yes, Brooklyn said. I'll take that. Because I'd never get out from under it otherwise, and I'm not going to pretend I would. But not the allowance. I'm not going to sit in your house being paid to be a wife. She held his eyes. Give me a job instead. Somebody runs that place, and whoever it is, they're doing it badly. Put me on the household. I'll work it off. Elias Roth stopped writing. He set the pen down on the folder, and he looked at her over the top of his glasses. And in 41 years of sitting in that chair, he had watched a great many people take money from this family, and he had never once watched somebody push it back across the table. He didn't say anything. But he looked at Jackson, and Jackson caught it. There was a long silence. Then Brooklyn said, Can I ask you something? Go ahead. If I say no. If I stand up right now and walk out and say, I don't want your marriage and I don't want your money, and I'll take my chances. She wasn't angry. Her voice hadn't risen at all. What happens to me? Jackson Vitale had answered harder questions than that in his life, and he had answered most of them without a pause, because in his work a pause is a wound, and men learn to speak before they think. He looked at the woman in the chair with the bottle sitting on the floor beside her. 1 second, 2, 3. I don't know, he said. They were at the Cook County Clerk's office on West Washington Street at 9 a.m, and it turned out that the most dangerous man in Chicago could not make the state of Illinois move any faster than it wanted to move. Elias Roth had explained it in the car. The license is issued the day you apply for it, but the law says you cannot use it until the following day, and there is no fee and no favor and no telephone call that changes that. Jackson had listened without expression and said, Then we come back tomorrow. And that was the end of it. Brooklyn found the whole thing oddly comforting. She stood in a line behind a young couple who kept checking the spelling on their form, and she filled out her own with a county pen chained to the counter. And when the clerk asked for her mother's maiden name, she said Dorothy Kaminsky, without her voice doing anything at all. Nobody in that building knew who the man beside her was. To the clerk, they were applicant 1 and applicant 2, and the clerk had a lunch break coming, and there was a poster on the wall about carbon monoxide detectors. It was the last ordinary hour Brooklyn Novak would have for a long time, and she didn't know that, and it was probably better that she didn't. The ceremony was the next morning in a room down the hall from where they had stood in line. It took under 4 minutes. Elias Roth was one witness, and a woman from the clerk's office was the other, and there were no flowers and no photographs, and Brooklyn wore the same coat she had worn on the bus the day before. Jackson said his part in a flat, carrying voice, the voice of a man reading terms into a record. When it came to hers, Brooklyn found that her mouth was dry, and that she said the words anyway, clearly, the way she had once read a hospital consent form back to a nurse to be certain she understood it. Afterward, Jackson signed the certificate and handed her the pen, and she signed underneath. And their handwriting sat next to each other on the same line for the first time. He didn't kiss her. Nobody had told him to, and it hadn't come up in the study, and Brooklyn was grateful in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone. In the car, he took out his phone and read something and said, It's done. Your accounts were paid at 8:40 this morning. She said thank you. He said, It was in the terms. And that was the whole conversation from West Washington Street to Lake Forest. Margaret Doyle was waiting inside the front doors with her hands folded, and she was somewhere past 60, and she had been running that house for 22 years, and she looked at Brooklyn's coat for about a second and a half, which was exactly as long as she needed. Mrs. Vitale, she said, in a tone that put quotation marks around it. Then she turned and started up the stairs without checking to see whether she was being followed. 3 flights, a long hallway with half the doors shut. Doyle stopped at the end of it and opened one. The lady of the house has always used the east wing, she said. Mr. Vitale keeps his rooms in the west. She said it the way a person reads a policy at a counter. And then she waited, and Brooklyn understood that this was the part where she was supposed to react. A tightening around the mouth, a question with a shake in it, something Margaret Doyle could carry back down the stairs and set out in the kitchen for the rest of them to look at. Brooklyn stepped into the room and set her bag down and turned around. Do you have a broom I can use? Doyle's eyebrows went up perhaps 1/4 of an inch. The staff handle that. I know they do. I'd still like a broom. She thought for a moment, and the vendor list, if there is one, whoever the house buys from. Linen, food, fuel, anything on a contract. The accounts go through the office. Then I'll ask the office. Brooklyn smiled, and it was a perfectly pleasant smile, and it gave the woman absolutely nothing. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle." Doyle stood there another second, recalculating, and then she left, and her footsteps went away down the hall at a slightly faster pace than they had come up it. Brooklyn sat down on the edge of the bed. She waited for the thing she had been braced for since the study. The drop. The moment when it came over her that she was 27 years old and locked in a stone house on the North Shore at the far end of a wing from a man she had met on Tuesday. It didn't come. What came instead, around 10 that night, was her phone sitting silent on the nightstand. It had been ringing 11 and 12 times a day for 4 years. It rang at 7:50 in the morning, and again at lunch, and again just after 6. And it had rung on Christmas, and it had rung the week her mother was dying, and she had learned to feel it start in her chest half a second before the sound. Now it lay there and did nothing. She kept looking at it. She turned the lamp off and lay in the dark and waited for the feeling in her chest to arrive out of habit. And it didn't come either. And somewhere in the middle of waiting, she stopped waiting. Brooklyn Novak slept 8 hours straight through for the first time in 4 years, and she didn't dream about anything at all. The vendor list came up on the 4th day, and it came up because Brooklyn asked for it a 4th time. This time in the office rather than the hallway, standing there until a young man printed it and handed it over with the look of somebody who has decided a thing isn't worth the argument. She took it upstairs and read it the way she read everything, slowly and from the top, the way her mother had taught her to read a bill in a kitchen in Portage Park when the two of them were splitting a phone plan 4 ways with the neighbors. Most of it was ordinary. The fuel oil was high, but that was the North Shore. The grocer was fair. The landscaping contract had a line for snow removal that ran the whole year, including July, and she circled that. Then she came to the laundry. Halloran Linen and Supply, Cicero, Illinois. $34,000 a month. She read it twice, and then she got up and walked down the hall, and came back and read it a 3rd time, because there is a difference between a number that is too high and a number that doesn't belong to the same world as the thing it's attached to. Brooklyn had spent 9 years in hotel housekeeping. She had worked 18 months at a 400-room property on North Michigan Avenue, where they turned over 300 rooms a night in season, sheets and towels and table linen for 2 restaurants and a banquet floor, and the whole laundry contract for that building had run under $30,000 a month. This house had 9 people living in it. 9. She counted them out on her fingers to be sure. Herself, Jackson, Doyle, the cook, 2 on the day staff, 1 on nights, and the 2 men at the gate who ate in the kitchen. Even if every one of them changed their sheets daily and threw every towel on the floor after a single use, it wasn't a 5th of that. She sat with it for a while. She was not a suspicious woman by nature. She had spent her working life around people who padded things, taxi drivers who took the long way, a supervisor at the Beaumont who wrote down hours nobody had worked, and her assumption in the ordinary course of things was that somebody was getting comfortable. She wrote Halloran on a fresh page and set it aside and kept going. Over the next 3 weeks, she went through the whole list the same way. She called the grocer and asked for the price sheet the restaurants got instead of the residential one. She found the house was buying bottled water by the case at a rate that made her laugh out loud alone in a room. She found $480 a month going to a linen rental for a formal dining room that had been used twice since spring. She canceled a wine storage service and had the crates moved into the cellar, which cost the price of 2 afternoons and one of the gate men's backs. Margaret Doyle fought her on almost all of it. Not loudly. Doyle didn't do anything loudly. She would stand with her hands folded and say that Mrs. Vitale, the elder Mrs. Vitale, had always preferred the arrangement as it stood, and that the house had been run this way for a long time and had never once embarrassed the family. "I'm sure it hasn't," Brooklyn said, "but nobody's been embarrassed by the water bill either, and we're paying 11 times retail for it." She never raised her voice, and she never pulled rank, mostly because she didn't feel she had any rank to pull, and after the 2nd week something in the house shifted. Doyle stopped arguing. She didn't warm up. Exactly. She simply started answering questions the first time they were asked, and one morning Brooklyn came down to find the July snow removal line crossed out on the copy in the office in Doyle's own handwriting. By the end of the 3rd week, the household operating cost was down 41%. She wrote it out in a single column on 1 page, because she had learned somewhere that people believe a page and don't believe a folder. There were 2 items on it she couldn't make sense of. One was a maintenance retainer to a company in Berwyn for an elevator the house didn't have. The other was Halloran. She found Elias Roth on a Thursday afternoon in the small room off the front hall where he did his work, and she waited in the doorway until he looked up. "I've got the household down 41%, she said. Doyle signed off. "Nothing's been cut that anybody will feel." Elias took his glasses off. "That's considerable. There's 2 things on here I couldn't square." She came in and set the page on his desk and turned it toward him. "There's an elevator contract for an elevator that doesn't exist. That's probably just somebody never canceling anything. And there's the laundry." She put a finger on the line. $34,000 a month. Cicero outfit called Halloran. "I worked a 400-room hotel that paid less than that. This house has 9 people in it. I've asked the office twice, and both times I got told it's a long-standing arrangement." Elias Roth put his glasses back on and looked at the page for a moment. His face didn't change in any way that Brooklyn could see, and she was watching, because watching faces was the thing she was best at. He picked the page up, folded it once down the middle, and opened the drawer on the right side of his desk and put it inside. "I'll look at it," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Vitale." She went back upstairs and thought no more about it. There was a great deal else to do that week, and a house is an endless thing, and she had a dinner for 8 coming on Saturday. 8 for dinner on Saturday, and the office sent up the names on Thursday morning the way they always did, and Brooklyn read them at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She knew 2 of them. The rest she asked about, casually, in the way a person asks who is coming to a thing she is responsible for feeding. The cook was a decent source. So was the younger of the 2 men at the gate, who had driven most of these people at one time or another, and had opinions about all of them. By Friday afternoon she had what she wanted, which was not a guest list, but something closer to a weather report. Ray Kessler talked more than anyone else in Cook County, and told the same 4 stories. A man named Petrosian laughed at everything, and laughed loudly. There was a lawyer from the Loop who muttered and looked at the tablecloth when he spoke, and Julian Vitale, who would come whether he was invited or not. Margaret Doyle had done the seating for that house for 22 years. She had a card in a drawer with the standing order on it, and it had been made in the time of the late Mr. Vitale, and had not been questioned since. Brooklyn asked to see it, looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds, and then took a fresh card and wrote out a different one. "That puts Mr. Kessler practically in his lap," Doyle said. "That's the idea. And Mr. Julian is all the way down at the far end. Somebody has to be at the far end." Doyle looked at the card a moment longer. There was no argument in it that she could put a shape to, and she had learned over the last 3 weeks that when this woman did something odd, there was generally a reason underneath it, even if she never bothered to say what the reason was. She put the old card back in the drawer. Brooklyn went into the dining room an hour before anyone arrived and did the last part herself. She set the head of the table, and then she stood behind the chair and looked down the length of the room, and then she took hold of the chair and turned it. Not much, 15 degrees maybe, so that a man sitting in it would be facing very slightly across the table rather than straight down it, so that every face at that table would fall on the same side of him, without a single person understanding that they had been arranged. She squared it up with the edge of the rug and stepped back and looked at it. Then she went to check the kitchen. Jackson came down at 7 and sat where he always sat. He did not notice the chair. He noticed, an hour later, that he had not once had to ask anybody to repeat themselves. It came to him in pieces the way a change in the weather does. Ray Kessler was 2 feet from his left shoulder, telling the story about the alderman and the boat, and Jackson could hear every word of it, including the parts Kessler mumbled, including the punchline that Kessler always threw away. Petrosian laughed, and the laugh landed somewhere out in front of him, instead of crashing over the top of everything. The lawyer from the Loop spoke into the tablecloth the way he always did, and Jackson caught it clean. All of it. The qualification at the end that he had been missing for years without knowing he was missing it. Somebody down the table asked him a question, and he answered it without doing the thing first, without the half-second of arithmetic, without watching the mouth and running the sentence twice to see which version made sense. He put his fork down at one point and sat still for a moment. 15 years. 15 years of leaving a room with a headache like a wire behind his eye, of getting into the car and closing the door, and putting his head back against the seat and thinking, "I got through it." He had believed that was simply the price of the work. He had believed every man in his position went home like that. Across the table, Julian Vitale was in conversation with Petrosian, far enough away that he was only a face and a voice among other voices, which was, Jackson noticed, an entirely restful thing to have him be. Brooklyn came in twice during the meal, once to bring something from the kitchen and once near the end, and she didn't look at Jackson either time, and she didn't look at the chair, and there was nothing in the way she moved through that room to suggest that anything in it had been touched. When the plates went out and the men moved off toward the other room, she gathered up 2 glasses that had been left behind and went out through the service door. Jackson watched her go. He watched the door swing and settle and go still. And he stayed where he was for a good deal longer than a man needs to stay in an empty dining room, with his hand resting on the back of a chair that was sitting 15 degrees off true. He didn't thank her. There was no way to say it that wouldn't have required saying the other thing out loud, in a house with staff in it, and the other thing had been kept quiet for 15 years. So he said nothing. 3 weeks later there was another dinner, 11 people this time, and Brooklyn wrote the card again, and again the chair sat 15 degrees off true. She never mentioned it. He never asked. The invitation came on a card, hand-delivered by a driver, which struck Brooklyn as a great deal of trouble for a woman who lived 20 minutes away and had a telephone. Lunch, Tuesday, 1 o'clock, at Vivian Vitale's house in Winnetka. There was no question mark anywhere on the card. She went. She thought about not going and then understood that not going would only move the conversation to a worse room on a worse day. The house was quiet and the table was set for 2, and there was somebody in the kitchen who never came out. Vivian asked about the drive. Brooklyn said the drive was fine. Vivian asked whether she had settled in, and Brooklyn said she had. And Vivian said that Margaret Doyle had been with the family a long time and could be difficult, and Brooklyn said that Mrs. Doyle had been perfectly professional. They got through the soup that way. It was, in its own manner, an impressive performance, and Brooklyn found she could admire it while knowing exactly what it was. When the plates were cleared, Vivian reached down beside her chair and brought up a slim leather folder and laid it on the table and opened it. There was a check inside and a printed itinerary. She turned them both around with 2 fingers so that they faced Brooklyn, and then she sat back. "That's $500,000, she said. "It's drawn on an account of mine, and it has nothing to do with my son, and he will never see it. The other one is a ticket. It's open-ended, so you can go whenever you like and wherever you like. And if you want a different city than the one on there, tell me and it'll be changed." Brooklyn looked at the paper without touching it. "I'd like you to understand that I'm not doing this to insult you," Vivian said. "I've watched a number of women come through that house over 30 years, and most of them wanted something I could name. You I can't name, and that's a great deal more frightening to me than greed." She folded her hands. "But you have to see what you are. You're not a wife. You're an incident. My son stood up in front of 22 people at my table and made a decision he had no business making, in a night that had taken me 4 months to arrange. And there are men in this city who watched him do it. That's not a marriage. That's a thing that happened, and things that happen can be undone. And the sooner it's undone, the less it costs everyone, including you." She let it sit for a moment, and then she added, more quietly, and Brooklyn believed she meant it, "You seem like a capable girl. I'd rather you took the money and had a life than stayed in that house and got used up in something you don't understand." Brooklyn was quiet for a while. Outside, a landscaping crew was working somewhere down the property, and the sound of it came thin through the glass. She thought about her mother, and about the way certain people had spoken to her mother in the last year, kindly, in that same voice, as if kindness were a thing that got poured downhill. Then she put 2 fingers on the folder and pushed it back across the table, slowly, all the way, until it sat in front of Vivian again. "Mrs. Vitale," she said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "How long were you married to Jackson's father?" 31 years. "And you've had a son 37 years. 37 in April." Brooklyn nodded slowly. "So that's a long time sitting next to somebody," she said. "Christmases, funerals, every dinner in that house. 37 years of being in rooms with him. I don't know what you're getting at. Which ear is it?" Vivian Vitale's face did not change at first. Then it did, in a way that had nothing to do with expression. The way a face changes when a person's attention leaves the room and goes hunting through years and comes back with nothing in its hands. "I'm sorry? Which ear can't he hear out of?" Brooklyn asked it the way you'd ask somebody the time. Left or right? The silence went on a good while. "There was an injury," Vivian said at last. 15 years ago. There was damage to the ear. They told us it was the ear, and there were procedures, and they said afterward that he'd recovered as well as anyone could have expected." She stopped. "He's never mentioned it since." "No," Brooklyn said. "He wouldn't have. He hears perfectly well. I've spoken to him 1,000 times. You've spoken to him 1,000 times and he's answered you 1,000 times. Brooklyn's voice stayed level, and there wasn't any triumph in it at all, which was somehow worse. Those aren't the same thing. He's very good at it. He's been doing it since he was 22. Vivienne looked down at the folder in front of her. Her hand was resting flat on top of it, and it stayed there. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life in rooms where you never let anyone see you counting. And she was counting now, going back through 37 years of table settings and car rides and hospital corridors, and she could not produce one single moment in which she had known. He never told me, she said. It came out flat, without self-pity, a statement of fact from a woman who dealt in facts. No, Brooklyn said. He told me in 90 seconds, and he didn't mean to. She stood up and picked up her coat off the back of the chair. Thank you for lunch, Mrs. Vital. She was almost at the door when Vivienne said, Wait. Brooklyn stopped. The right, Vivienne said. It wasn't a question. It's the right, isn't it? Yes. And Brooklyn went out to the car, and behind her the older woman sat alone at a cleared table with a check in front of her that she never did put away. The meeting on the second Thursday in November ran long, and it ran badly, and it was held in the front room because the study was too small for 9 men. Somebody had opened a window. There was a truck idling out on the drive, and a man from the trucking side sat down on Jackson's right without asking, the way men did, and talked the whole time with his chin turned toward the table. We're looking at $420,000 to clear it, he said. Jackson heard 42. It sat wrong immediately, the way a wrong number does, but there was nothing to hang the correction on, and 8 men were waiting on him, and he had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to give yourself away is to ask a man to say a thing twice. He was 3/4 of a second from agreeing to it. The door opened and Brooklyn came in with a pitcher, the way she had come in twice a week for a month, and she went around the table filling glasses, and when she got to the far end, she said to the room in general, in the voice of somebody confirming a grocery order, 420,000. I've got it written down, if anybody wants it after. Then she went out. The trucking man said, That's right, 420. And the meeting moved on, and 8 men in that room understood nothing had happened at all. Jackson sat with his hand flat on the table for a moment, exactly the way he had sat through a violin. Then he said, 420 is too much. Come back to me under 3. That was the smaller thing that November. The larger thing began 9 days later, when Enzo Barone withdrew from the Harlem Avenue development, and then from the freight terminal in Bedford Park, and did both inside a single week, and did neither of them quietly. There were ways to step out of an arrangement that let everybody keep their footing. A man could plead his banks. He could plead his age. Enzo Barone instead sent his lawyer to a room with 3 other families in it, and had the man read out that the Barone interests were reconsidering their exposure to the Vitali organization at this time, and reconsidering exposure is a phrase that carries a long way in that city. By the end of the month, 2 people who had taken Jackson's calls for 11 years were not taking them. There was a benefit at the Drake in the first week of December, the kind of evening where money in Chicago goes to look at itself, and Sienna Barone came to it on Julian Vitali's arm, not clinging, not making a display, simply there, beside him, all evening, and photographed twice, and by the following morning it had gone everywhere that mattered, without a single person having to say a word out loud. Elias Roth brought the photograph to Jackson at the house, and set it down and said nothing. How long? Jackson asked. Since October, apparently. Nobody thought to mention it. Julian came out to Lake Forest 3 days later. He came without calling first, which he had always done, and he came in through the kitchen the way he had since he was a boy, and he stood in the doorway of the study with his coat still on. You want to hear it from me, or from somebody else? He said. Say it. Enzo's not going to move. I've spent 2 weeks on him. Julian came in and sat down, on the right, where he always sat. He's not even angry, Jack. That's the trouble with it. Angry I could work with. He's embarrassed. He put his daughter in a room in front of everybody, and everybody watched what happened, and now every man his age in this city knows about it. He spread his hands. You know what it costs to make a man like that feel small in front of his friends. He'll spend money he doesn't have to make it right. I'm aware. Then let me say the thing nobody else will say to you. Julian leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, and his voice went easy and warm and reasonable, the voice of a man doing a difficult favor. 18 months. That's what she signed. That's what Elias tells me. Nobody's asking you to throw the girl out on the street. Pay her. Set her up somewhere. Do it decently. And in a year and a half, this is a story people tell at dinner and laugh about. And then you sit down with Enzo, and you fix it the way it's always been fixed. A proper marriage. It puts the whole thing back where it was, and it costs you nothing you'd miss. Jackson looked at him for a long moment. No. Jack. I said no. Julian sat back. He didn't argue, and he didn't sulk. And afterward, Jackson would think about that. About how a man who has driven 40 minutes to make a case usually makes it at least twice. Julian just looked at him with his head a little tilted, the way he might look at a hand of cards that had turned out more interesting than expected. All right, he said. And then he smiled. It was a perfectly pleasant smile, the same one he had been giving people across that family's tables for 30 years, and Jackson had seen it 10,000 times, and never once thought anything about it. You know your own business, Julian said. He stood up and buttoned his coat. On his way out, he stopped at the door. She's a smart girl, that one, he said. Where'd she come from again? She had been sleeping badly all week, and at 2 a.m. she gave up on it and went down for water, and there was light coming out from under the study door. She stood in the hall for a moment with the glass in her hand. Then she knocked once and pushed it open and set the water down on the corner of the desk, on the left side, where she always set things. Jackson was sitting with a stack of paper in front of him that he plainly hadn't touched in an hour. You're up, he said. So are you. He looked at the glass. Sit down a minute. She sat. The house made the small sounds an old house makes at 2 a.m, and neither of them said anything for a while. And then Jackson said, Julian came out Tuesday. I know. I saw the car. He wanted me to end it. You and me. Wait out the 18 months. Pay you off. Then marry Sienna Barone and put the thing back the way it was. He said it without softening it. The way he had said everything to her since the first night, and Brooklyn found she preferred it. I told him no. She nodded. She didn't ask why. That was the moment, he thought afterward, when he decided, not because she had asked, but because she hadn't. You've never asked me about it, he said. About the ear. It's not mine to ask about. No, he agreed. It isn't. He turned the glass a quarter turn on the desk and left it. I'm going to tell you anyway. Brooklyn sat very still. My brother Marco was 7 years older than me, he said. He was the one being brought up for it. I was 22, and I was mostly a nuisance, which suited me. There was a car. It was the 6th of March, and it was cold, and I was standing maybe 25 feet away from it, about the distance from here to that window, and I don't remember the actual thing at all. There's no picture in my head of it. I've been told that's common. He stopped. I woke up 2 days later in a room at Northwestern, and my brother was dead, and the whole right side of the world was gone. Brooklyn didn't move. It wasn't the ear, he said. That's what they told my mother, because that's the easier thing to tell somebody's mother. And there were procedures, and there was a great deal of talk about recovery. But it was never the ear. It was the nerve, and a nerve doesn't grow back. There was a surgeon who sat down on the edge of the bed and told me the truth about it, and he's the only man who ever did. He's been dead 9 years now. Him and Elias. That's the whole list of people who knew, before you. He said the last part without accusation, as a piece of information. My father lived another 4 years, he went on. He never was the same after Marco, and by the end of it, he wasn't really running anything. I took it over at 26 years old, in a room full of men who'd known me since I was in short pants, and if any one of them had found out what I was, I'd have been finished inside a month. Not killed, necessarily, just finished, which in that room is the same thing. He looked up at her for the first time since he'd started. Do you understand why I couldn't say it? Yes. Say it back to me. Brooklyn was quiet a moment. Because if they know which ear, she said, they know where to stand. Jackson Vitale sat there and looked at this woman across his desk at 2 a.m. A woman he had known for 11 weeks, who had just handed him back in one sentence, the thing he had spent 15 years building his entire life around, and had never once been able to say out loud to anybody. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. He waited then. He was braced for it. And he realized he'd been braced for it since the first word, and what he expected was the thing everybody does. The softening of the voice, the tilt of the head, the terrible, gentle sound people make when they've decided you're something to be careful with. He had watched it happen to men in wheelchairs at parties. He would rather have taken a beating, Brooklyn drank some of her own water and set the glass down. "Then stop sitting with your back to the door," she said. Jackson blinked. "What?" "That chair." She pointed at it with 2 fingers. "You've got the door behind your right shoulder. Anybody who comes down that hall, you won't hear until they're standing in the room with you. You've got a whole desk here. Turn it around, put the door on your left and the window at your back, and you'll see the hallway in the glass besides." She shrugged slightly. "You've been doing this 15 years, and you've got the one thing in this house arranged backwards." And Jackson Vitale laughed. It came out of him rough and startled and unpracticed. A sound he hadn't made in front of another person in longer than he could put a number to, and it stopped almost as soon as it started, and it left the room somehow altered. "It's a heavy desk," he said. "There's 2 men at the gate doing nothing," said Brooklyn, and she picked up her glass and went to bed. The place in River North had been theirs for 19 years. It sat on a side street off Hubbard with no sign on it, 11 tables, and on a Tuesday in the middle of December, there were 4 of them occupied, and none of the people at them were strangers. Jackson took the corner as he always did, back to the wall. Elias sat across. Brooklyn sat on his left. She hadn't asked to come. He had said, on the way out to the car, "You should see the room where half of it actually happens," and she had gotten her coat, and neither of them had made anything more of it than that. They ate. Elias talked about the elevator contract, which had turned out to be exactly what she'd guessed. A company in Berwyn billing for 9 years on a building that had been sold in 2009. Jackson said something dry about it. Brooklyn laughed. It was, she thought later, the first ordinary hour any of them had spent in a month. She noticed the man because of the way he was walking. That was all. She had carried trays through rooms for 9 years, and there is a rhythm to how people move through a restaurant. A hurry to the ones going to the kitchen, a distraction to the ones going to the door, and this man had neither. He had come in from the front, and he was crossing the floor at a pace that would not have turned a single head, angling wide around the tables, and he was going to arrive at the corner from Jackson's right shoulder. He wasn't looking at Jackson's face. He was looking at the back of Jackson's head. Brooklyn's hand was already moving before her mind had finished the sentence, because there was a piece of information sitting in her chest that nobody else in that room had, which was that the man had chosen his side. There was no time to say a name. There was no time to say anything, and screaming would have cost half a second and would have made him hurry. So she did the thing her hands had been trained to do for 9 years. She swept her arm across the table and took the glasses with it, all of them, and put the whole tray of them onto the tile floor. The sound it made was enormous. Glass going off a tile floor in a small stone room is not a delicate noise. It is a detonation, and every head in that restaurant came around, and the man's step broke, and in that half-beat, Brooklyn had both hands in the shoulder of Jackson's coat and was hauling him sideways and down with every pound she had. He was twice her weight. It didn't matter. Nobody stays upright when they're pulled at the shoulder from an angle they aren't braced for. He went out of the chair, and she went with him. The shot came while they were falling. It was not like the movies at all. It was a flat, hard crack in a small room, and then a second sound underneath it. A solid thud. And the chair back where Jackson's shoulders had been an instant earlier jumped and splintered. Something went through the sleeve of Brooklyn's coat at the shoulder and burned like a hot wire laid on the skin and was gone. Then the room came apart. There were 2 of their men by the front, and a third who had been standing at the bar the whole time, and none of them shouted anything intelligible. And there was a scrape of tables and a heavy crash somewhere near the door, and the sound of a man going down hard on tile, and then a great deal of movement and voices, and, quite suddenly, no more shooting. Elias Roth had gone flat behind the table and came up on one knee, with his glasses hanging off one ear. Brooklyn found she was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. She was not certain how she had gotten there. There was broken glass all around her, in the folds of her coat, on the tile between her knees, and she looked at her hands and watched them shaking and thought, in a detached and faintly interested way, that they were shaking a great deal. Her left sleeve was open from the shoulder seam down about 4 inches. She kept looking at it. It was a good coat. It was the coat she had worn to the clerk's office on West Washington Street. Then Jackson was in front of her, down on both knees on the glass, and he had her face in his hands and was turning it toward the light. "Look at me, Brooklyn. Look at me. I'm all right. Where? It's the sleeve." She heard her own voice come out steady, and it surprised her. "It went through the sleeve. It's nothing. It's like a burn." He didn't believe her. She could see him not believing her. He got his hand under the torn wool and moved it and looked, and whatever he saw made the whole set of his shoulders drop by about an inch, and he closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said something to Elias without turning his head, and Elias started talking on a phone. Jackson stayed where he was, on his knees, in the glass, in front of her, and Brooklyn Novak, 27 years old, sitting on the floor of a restaurant with her hands shaking in her lap, understood two things at once. The first was that a man had walked into that room and gone deliberately to the one side of Jackson Vitale, where a person cannot be heard coming. The second was that he had known to do it. They didn't take her to a hospital. She understood why, on the way, when Elias explained in the front seat that any gunshot wound walking into an emergency room in the state of Illinois gets a phone call to the police before the doctor finishes washing his hands, and there would be a report, and the report would have her name on it and Jackson's name on it, and it would sit in a file forever. So they went to a 2-story building on Halsted Street in Bridgeport, with a dentist's office on the ground floor, and a physician upstairs who had been treating that family for 30 years and who asked no questions. At all. It took 11 stitches. The doctor said the word graze twice, and told her she'd have a scar about the length of a thumbnail, and that she'd been extraordinarily lucky. And Brooklyn sat on the paper-covered table with her arm out, and thought about how strange it was that a man could say lucky in that room and mean it. Jackson stood by the window the entire time, with his back to her. He didn't speak once. When it was finished, she came out into the small waiting area, with her coat over her shoulders, and one sleeve hanging empty, and Elias Roth was standing there with his phone in his hand, and his face gone gray. "It's Danny Pruitt," Elias said. "He's out of Melrose Park. He's freelance, and he's already talking, which tells you what kind of freelance." He paused. "Jackson, he came in the front, and he crossed the whole floor to take a shot from your right shoulder, past 2 of our people, with a clear angle from the left the entire time. He gave up 8 or 9 feet to do it. Nobody said anything. He was told," Elias said. "Somebody told him which side." Brooklyn watched it happen. She watched it move across Jackson Vitale's face, and it was not rage, and it was not fear. It was something worse than either. A kind of cold, settling, like water going to ice in a still glass. He turned and looked at her. She knew what the question was before he asked it. She saw it arrive in him, and she saw him do nothing to stop it. "Who did you tell?" The room was very quiet. "Nobody," Brooklyn said. "Not a friend. Not somebody at the hotel. Not somebody you owed money to before I cleared it. Nobody. 3 months, Jackson said. 15 years and nothing. And you've been in my house 3 months. He wasn't shouting. That was the thing she would remember about it afterward. That he never once raised his voice. That he said it all in the flat, reasonable tone of a man reading a column of figures aloud. "You knew inside 90 minutes at a dinner table. You'd never met me. That's not a thing a person does, Brooklyn. I've been telling myself for 3 months it's a thing a person does," Elias said. "Jackson, don't." Brooklyn stood there with her coat over her shoulders. There was a poster on the wall about blood pressure. She looked at it because it was easier than looking at anything else in that room, and she waited to feel angry. And what came instead was something quieter and far heavier, the recognition of a thing she had actually known all along and had allowed herself, for 11 weeks, to stop knowing. "I've been in rooms with people my whole life," she said. "Since I was 18. I've carried trays past men making deals and women crying on the phone, and I've stood in the corner while people said things they'd have gone to jail for. And not one of them ever stopped, because not one of them ever saw me. 27 years, and I was furniture." She turned and looked at him. "You saw me in 4 minutes, and I thought that meant you trusted what you saw." She shook her head slowly. "I was wrong. You didn't see a person. You saw a hole in your security. You've been watching that hole for 3 months to find out where it leaks." Jackson didn't answer her. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. She waited, and gave him the time to take it back, and he stood there by the window in that little room on Halsted Street, with his jaw set, and said nothing at all. "All right," Brooklyn said. "It was done inside 40 minutes. Elias handled it, because Elias handled everything, and he did it with a decency that only made it worse. The debt was gone, and it stayed gone. That had been in the terms, and Jackson did not touch it. The agreement was ended early. There would be papers later. There was a car waiting downstairs, and a driver who did not look at her in the mirror. They went back to Lake Forest first, so that she could get her things, and it took her under 10 minutes, because everything she owned still fit in the same bag it had arrived in. Margaret Doyle was standing at the bottom of the stairs when she came down. The older woman looked at the empty sleeve and the bag, and she opened her mouth and then shut it again, and what she finally said was, "The vendor file's in the second drawer. I've left it the way you had it." Brooklyn nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle." Then she got in the car, and it took her back down the Edens Expressway to the apartment on the northwest side that she had not been inside since September, where the mail had piled up under the slot and the refrigerator was empty, and the phone on the counter did not ring at all. The Beaumont took her back without any fuss at all, which she had expected, because housekeeping in a 400-room hotel in January is a hole that never fills. The floor supervisor asked where she'd been, and Brooklyn said family, and the woman said, "Sorry to hear it," and put her on 14. Nobody asked about the arm. She kept the long sleeves on and worked left-handed for the first 10 days, and nobody noticed that either. And she found there was a great deal of comfort in a building where nobody looked at her, the same comfort a person finds in a bath that is slightly too hot. Out in Lake Forest, the house went back to the way it had been. Margaret Doyle put the old seating card back in the drawer, not out of spite, but because there was no longer anybody to write a new one. And at the January dinner, Ray Kessler sat on the right and talked for an hour and a half. Jackson came out of that room with the wire behind his eye and stood in the hall for a moment with his hand against the wall. The desk in the study never did get turned around. It was the 22nd of January when she went into 1409. It was a suite, and the suites on that floor took twice as long, and she was halfway through the sitting room with the vacuum when she stopped. She couldn't have said what stopped her. There was nothing in the room. It was stripped and clean, and the windows were doing what they always did with the winter light. But she was standing at the end of the couch with her hand on the vacuum, and something had gone through her the way a smell goes through you in a doorway. And then it came, all of it, the way those things come, not as a thought but as a picture. The 3rd of March, she knew the date the way she knew her own birthday, because it had been the first one, the anniversary of the morning her mother died, and she had gotten up that day and put on the uniform and taken the blue line downtown, because there was nothing else to do with a day like that, and because she had needed the 8 hours. She had knocked at 1409 at 11 in the morning and gotten no answer. She had knocked twice more. She had used her key, and there had been 2 men in that sitting room, at that table by the window, and one of them had come up out of his chair before she'd gotten the door all the way open. "Get out!" Not shouted. Exactly. Worse than shouted. The flat, contemptuous bark a man gives a dog that has come into the wrong room. And then, already turning back to the table before she'd even started backing out, "Christ, don't they knock." She had said, "Sorry, sir," and pulled the door shut, and stood in the corridor with her cart for a second the way you do, and then gone on to 1411, because there were 19 more rooms on that list, and it was the 3rd of March, and she had wanted to keep her hands busy. She had not looked at his face for more than a second, but she had looked at it. She was standing in the same room 11 months later, with her hand on a vacuum cleaner, and she could see it perfectly, and it was Julian Vitale. And the other man, the older one, still seated, who had not turned around at all, who had waited with his hands flat on the table for the interruption to remove itself, was a man whose photograph she had since seen in a newspaper on Jackson Vitale's desk, and whose daughter had once sat at Jackson Vitale's right hand and laughed behind her palm. Brooklyn sat down slowly on the arm of the couch. The 3rd of March. She counted it out because she needed to be sure of it. March to November, and it came to 8 months. 8 months before Enzo Barone stood up in a room full of people and pulled out of Harlem Avenue and Bedford Park and let it be known that he was reconsidering his exposure. 8 months before any of them were supposed to be enemies. And then, sitting there on the arm of a couch in an empty suite, she remembered the trash. She had gone back in that afternoon after they'd checked out, the way she always did, because the afternoon turn is when you actually clean a room. There had been very little in it. 2 coffee cups, and in the bin under the desk, a small cardboard box, the kind a cheap phone comes in, split open at the end, where somebody had pulled the phone out of it in a hurry. She remembered that because she'd flattened it before it went in the bag, and she had thought, without any particular interest, that a man staying in a suite at the Beaumont doesn't usually buy the $30 phone, and underneath it, folded twice, an invoice. She had glanced at it the way you glance at anything before you throw it away. A green header, a company name across the top, the kind that has 2 words and an ampersand, and it had meant absolutely nothing to her on the 3rd of March. It had meant nothing to her in September either, when she sat at a kitchen table in Lake Forest, reading a vendor list, and wrote one name on a fresh page, because the number attached to it belonged to a different world than the house it was billed to. Halloran Linen and Supply. Brooklyn put her hand over her mouth. She had held that piece in her hand twice, 11 months apart, and both times she had set it down and gone on to the next room. She thought about it for 2 days and she did not go to Jackson. That was not pride, or not only pride. It was arithmetic. She had already been accused once of being the leak in that house, and if she walked back in the front door in January with a story about a hotel room and an invoice, there was exactly one way a man in his position would read it, and she had watched his face go to ice once already, and had no wish to watch it again. So she went to Elias Roth, and on the train downtown she made herself sit with the other half of it, the half she had been walking around for 2 days. Elias Roth had been in that family since before Jackson could walk. Elias Roth was one of the 2 men on Earth who had known about the ear, and one of those 2 men was dead. Elias Roth had taken the page out of her hand in September, folded it once, and put it in a drawer, and in the 3 months that followed, nobody had ever mentioned it to her again. She got off at Clark and Lake and stood on the corner in the cold and understood, with a perfect and unhurried clarity, that if she was wrong about him, she would not be going home. He kept a small office above a currency exchange on West Randolph Street. 2 rooms, a frosted glass door with no name on it. He was alone. He looked up when she came in, and he did not look surprised, and Brooklyn stayed standing by the door with her hand still on it. "Mrs. Vitale," he said. "It isn't that anymore. The paperwork says it is for another 16 months. He took his glasses off. "Sit down. I'll stand for a minute." Elias Roth looked at her, at the door she hadn't shut, at the way she was standing, and something went across his face that she couldn't read. "You think it might have been me," he said. "You said it yourself in Bridgeport. Somebody told that man which side to come from. There were 2 of you." "3, Elias said. "You were in the room too." "I know." He nodded slowly, and then he did the strangest thing. He pushed his chair back from the desk, put both hands flat on the arms of it where she could see them, and sat like that. "All right," he said. "Then say what you came to say from where you're standing. And if you don't like the way it goes, that door opens outward, and I'm 61 years old." Brooklyn stood there a moment longer, then she shut the door. "There was a suite at the Beaumont last March," she said. "The 3rd of March. I know the date. I walked in on 2 men at a table. One of them threw me out. It was Julian." Elias didn't move. "The other one was Enzo Barone." 8 months before they were supposed to have anything to say to each other, Elias said. "Yes, and you're only telling me now. I only remembered on Thursday," Brooklyn said. "I've cleaned that room 40 times. It came back to me standing in it." She took a breath. "There's more. When I turned it over that afternoon, there was a burner phone box in the bin, and there was an invoice folded up under it. I threw both of them in the bag. I've been trying for 2 days to be sure of what was on the invoice, and I'm sure now, because I saw the same name again in September, and it stuck in my head." She said it. "Halloran Linen and Supply." Elias Roth sat perfectly still for about 4 seconds. Then he reached down and opened the drawer on the right side of his desk, and took out a folded page, and opened it flat on the blotter, and turned it around so that it faced her. It was her handwriting. 1 column, 1 page, the elevator contract in Berwyn and the laundry in Cicero, written at a kitchen table in Lake Forest in the 3rd week of September. $34,000 a month for 9 people, he said. "I've been on it since the day you handed it to me. It took 11 weeks, because I couldn't use anybody in the family to do it." He put 2 fingers on the page. "There's no laundry. There's a lot in Cicero with a building on it, and a phone that gets answered. And there are invoices going out to 14 entities across this state. And they're all ours, or they were. It's a wash. Money goes in dirty against work that was never done, and comes out the other side clean, and it doesn't come back to the family. It goes 2 places." Brooklyn didn't say anything. "One of them is a management company that Enzo Barone's son-in-law is the sole officer of," Elias said. "The other is a trust in Delaware, and it took me 6 weeks to get a name off the trust, and the name is Julian's." He sat back. "Over 11 years, it's a little over $40 million. The room was very quiet. Out on Randolph Street, a truck went past, and the frosted glass shook slightly in the door. $40 million, Brooklyn said. "That's not stealing from a man. That's building something." "Yes," Elias said. "It is." He looked down at the page in front of him, at the small, careful, ordinary handwriting on it, and then he looked up at the woman standing on the other side of his desk, in a hotel uniform, under a winter coat. "Do you understand what you did in September?" he asked. "You handed me this thinking it was a laundry bill." Elias Roth got up and went into the other room and was gone a long while, and when he came back, he was carrying a box file that had gone brown along the edges, the way paper does when it has sat somewhere warm for a decade and a half. He set it on the desk between them and didn't open it right away. "I want to tell you something first," he said. 9 days ago, when we were standing in Bridgeport, I believed there were 3 people alive who knew about Jackson's ear. You, me, and a man in the ground. So did he. That's why he said what he said to you. I know why he said it. Yes, but I want you to have the whole of it." Elias sat down. The surgeon told 2 people in that hospital. He told the patient, and he told me. Because I was the one signing things while his father was falling apart in a corridor. He wrote nothing down. There was no chart entry, because I asked him not to make one, and he was a decent man, and he didn't. He put his hand on the box. But there were 4 days between the explosion and that conversation. And in those 4 days, a 22-year-old boy was lying in a bed with tubes in him, and a great many people came in and out of that room. Brooklyn understood before he said it. "Family," she said. "Family." Elias agreed. He opened the file then. It was mostly a fire marshal's report, and a set of photographs she was glad were face down. And underneath those, a schedule, a plain thing, a week's worth of movements written in columns, the sort of paper a large organization makes and forgets. "The 6th of March, Elias said. Marco was supposed to be in Rockford that morning. It was on the schedule for 11 days. He was supposed to leave from the office on Grand Avenue at 7 in the morning in the gray car, and he was supposed to be gone before anybody else got there. He turned the page around. That's the schedule as it went out on the 1st of March. And this, he laid a second sheet beside it, is the one that was in the office on the 5th. Rockford's moved to the afternoon. The car's changed. The pickup is at the house instead, at 9, and Jackson's name is on it too, because they were going to drop him downtown on the way." Brooklyn looked at the 2 pages. "Who changed it?" "The revisions went out of that office under one signature for 11 years, Elias said. "Look at the bottom of the page." She looked. "After the funeral, nobody ever went back and read this," he said. "There was no reason to. The men who did it were dead within a month, and everybody in that family understood who had sent them, and the answer was correct as far as it went. What nobody asked was how those men knew where a car was going to be at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, when it had been going somewhere else at 7 for 11 days. Brooklyn sat down. She had been standing all this time and she hadn't noticed. 15 years, she said. He's been sitting at that table 15 years. Yes. Then why didn't he take it? He could have had it that week. Jackson was 22 and in a hospital bed, and his father was finished. Everybody says so. Why wait 15 years? Elias took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and he looked, for a moment, like exactly what he was, which was an old man who had been in one room for 4 decades, because he'd have gotten a chair and nothing else, he said. You have to understand what he'd have inherited. A name, some men who were loyal to a dead man, and a business that turned over money everybody could see. He'd have been sitting on top of a thing that ran on other people's goodwill, and goodwill can be taken back. He put the glasses down. What he wanted wasn't the chair. It was to arrive at the chair, already holding everything that mattered. And that takes time. It takes 11 years of a laundry that doesn't launder anything, and a partner on the outside with his own name and his own men, and $40 million in a place nobody in this family can reach. He looked at the box on the desk. The marriage was the last piece. Sienna Barone in that house and Enzo's arm around it. And then the 2 things become one thing, and Jackson is a figurehead in his own house inside 2 years, or he's an inconvenience, and inconveniences get handled. And then Jackson stood up at that table, Brooklyn said, and picked the girl with the wine bottle. And a schedule that had run for 15 years came apart in 11 seconds, said Elias Roth. Neither of them said anything for a while. Brooklyn was thinking about a dining room in September, about a man 4 chairs down on the right who had narrowed his eyes and not looked at Jackson at all. He always sits on that side, she said quietly. Every table, every car, since they were boys. Elias Roth met her eyes and didn't answer, because there wasn't anything to add to it, and because they had both arrived at the same place at the same moment, which was the understanding that for 15 years a man had chosen the one seat in every room where he could say whatever he liked, in front of anyone he liked, to a brother who would never quite catch it, and would nod, and would smile, and would let it go by. Alias said it plainly on the way down the stairs. Jackson could not call the sit-down himself. Not for this. Not against his own blood, with the whole table watching. A man who summons the families to accuse his cousin had better be certain the room will sit still long enough to hear him. And after the restaurant on Hubbard, there were men in that city who were no longer certain of anything where the Vitale name was concerned. There was one person alive who could put every one of them in a room and make them stay in it. And she had buried a husband and a son and had been walking into those rooms since before half the men in them were born. So Brooklyn Novak went back out to Winnetka. Vivienne received her in the same room. She did not ask about the arm, though her eyes went to it, and she did not ask why a woman she had tried to buy in September was standing in her house in January. She said, "Sit down," and Brooklyn sat. And then Brooklyn told her all of it. From the beginning, in order, in the flattest voice she could manage. The suite at the Beaumont on the 3rd of March, the invoice in the bin, the laundry in Cicero with no laundry in it, and the 40 million, and the trust in Delaware with a name on it, and then the schedule from the 5th of March, 15 years ago, with the time changed and the car changed, and the pickup moved to the house. Vivienne Vitale did not interrupt her once. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap. And when Brooklyn finished, she went on sitting exactly that way. And the room stayed quiet for a long time. A clock somewhere behind her kept going. "Say the last part again," she said finally. Julian changed the schedule. "Yes, Julian. The revisions went out under one signature for 11 years. Elias has the pages." Vivienne looked at the window. She was a woman who had spent 50 years arranging rooms so that nothing unplanned could happen in them. And Brooklyn watched her go through this one the way you watch somebody search a house they thought was empty. "There's a thing I have to tell you," Vivienne said at last, "and I would rather not." "All right. The dinner in September." She said it slowly. "I've told everyone for 4 months that it was mine. That I arranged it. That it took me the better part of a year. That I chose those 3 women out of every family in this state." She stopped. "The idea wasn't mine. It came from Julian." Brooklyn didn't move. "It was last February. He came out here on some other business and stayed for lunch. And he said, apropos of nothing, that a man in Jackson's position, who reaches 37 with no wife and no children, starts to look unfinished, and that people had begun to talk, and that if I didn't do something about it, nobody would." Her mouth tightened very slightly. "He said it the way he says everything. Like he was doing me a kindness by mentioning it, and then over the next month or so, in pieces, so that I never once felt I was being handed anything. He happened to say that the Barone girl was well thought of, that Enzo would take it as an honor, that it would settle a number of things at once." Vivienne turned her head and looked at Brooklyn directly. "I put that list together myself. I was very proud of it. I sat at this table with a pen and I believed every name on it was mine. He didn't need you to be stupid," Brooklyn said. "He needed you to be his mother." "Yes." Vivienne let out a breath. "That's what it was." The clock kept going. "I want to say one more thing to you and then we'll get on with it," she said. "You ruined my dinner. 22 people at my table. 4 months of my work. And my son stood up in the middle of it and put a serving girl in front of all of them." She looked at her hands. "I hated you for that. Every day since September. I hated you when you sat in this room and pushed that check back at me. And I hated you more afterward, because you'd been right." Brooklyn said nothing. Then Vivienne Vitale stood up. She crossed the room to the sideboard, where a pitcher stood with the glasses beside it, and she took one of the glasses, and she filled it, and she carried it back across her own drawing room and set it down on the table in front of Brooklyn Novak. And then, because there was no other way that a woman like that could have done it, she came around to the left side of the chair and set the second glass down for herself, and sat. It took about 11 seconds altogether. Nobody said the word sorry. Nobody was ever going to. Brooklyn looked at the glass in front of her for a moment, and then picked it up and drank some of it, and set it down again. And that was the whole of the thing that passed between them. "How long do you need?" Vivienne asked. "Elias says the files can be ready inside a week." "Then we'll do it Thursday." She reached for the telephone on the table beside her, and her hand was perfectly steady. "There are 9 men who have to be in that room. 7 of them will come because I ask. The other 2 will come because they'll be afraid of what it means if they don't." She lifted the receiver. "Get Jackson on the phone," she said. "I'll tell him myself." They met on Thursday afternoon in the long room at the Lake Forest house. 9 men around a table and no staff in the building, and every one of them had been told only that Vivienne Vitale had asked. Brooklyn stood at the back by the doors. That had been Jackson's decision, and he had made it in front of all of them inside the first minute. Because a man called Petrosian looked at her when he came in and said, not unkindly, that this was a table matter. "She stays," Jackson said. "She's the reason there's a meeting." "Jack, with respect, she isn't family. She was shot standing next to me 5 weeks ago, and none of you sent so much as a phone call." He said it without heat. "She stays, and if any man here wants to leave over it, the door's behind him." Nobody left. It was the first time in 11 years that Jackson Vitale had spent his own standing on something that couldn't be counted, and every man in that room made a note of it. Elias Roth had the files. He took them through it the way he had taken that family through 40 years of things. Slowly, without adjectives, 1 page at a time. The laundry in Cicero with a phone that got answered, and a building with nothing in it. 14 entities. 11 years. $41 million in change. Out through the wash, and into a management company, whose only officer was Enzo Barone's son-in-law, and into a Delaware trust with Julian Vitale's name on the paper. Then he laid down the 2 schedules from the 1st and the 5th of March, 15 years ago, side by side, and he said, "This is the last one." And he did not say anything else about it at all. He let 9 men read it for themselves. The room was very quiet by then. Julian Vitale sat through all of it with his hands loose on the table, and when Elias finished he shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's been asked to be patient with something foolish. "Paper," he said. "Elias, I've watched you file paper for 30 years, and I've never once seen you produce a piece of it that couldn't be read 2 ways. He turned to the table. Easy. Reasonable. The voice he'd used 1,000 times. "A trust in Delaware. Do you know how many men in this room have a name on a trust in Delaware? Raise your hands and let's count." 1 or 2 of them almost smiled. "And where does all this come from?" "That's the part I'd want to know." Julian leaned back. "It comes from her." He didn't look at Brooklyn. He gestured toward the back of the room with 2 fingers, the way a man points out a chair. "It comes from a woman who was carrying a tray in this house 4 months ago. Gentlemen, we're sitting here at this table, in this house, and you're being asked to believe a hotel maid." Somebody shifted. Jackson Vitale stood up. "Say that again," he said. "Jack." "No, say it again. Say the part about the maid." Julian's jaw moved slightly. He said nothing. "You've been sitting on my right for 15 years, Jackson said. He said it into a room so quiet that the radiator was audible. "Every table. Every car. Since we were boys. You took that chair because you thought I couldn't hear you." He looked around the table then, at 8 men who had known him since he was a child, and he said the thing he had spent half his life making certain nobody would ever find out. "I'm deaf in my right ear. Since the 6th of March, 15 years ago. That's what came out of that car besides my brother." Nobody moved. "And she," he said, "stood behind every one of you for 9 years carrying trays, and you thought she didn't see anything." He let it sit. "One of us judged that wrong." Julian Vitale stood up. He did it without hurry, and there was no shouting, and there was no speech, and Brooklyn saw the whole of it before anyone at the table did, because she was the only one standing, and because she had been watching the way that man moved for 4 months. He came around the end of the table. He came up the right side, and he had his hand inside his coat, and his voice when it came was almost gentle. "You never did hear me coming," he said. "Jackson." It came out of her at the top of her lungs, the first time in 4 months and 11 days that she had ever said his name, and it went across that room like something thrown. Jackson turned his head. He turned it toward the sound, toward his left, toward the back of the room and the woman standing at the doors, and in turning he came off the line, and Elias Roth's hand closed on Julian's forearm from the other side, and Petrosian came out of his chair, and it was over in about 4 seconds without a shot fired, and without anybody saying much of anything. They put him in a chair. Jackson stood over his cousin for a long moment. Every man in that room was waiting for the same thing. Because there was only one way that ended in that family, and there had been for 100 years. "No," Jackson said. He said it to the room as much as to Julian. "Elias walks the whole file into the United States Attorney's office on Dearborn Street Monday morning. All of it. The trust, the entities, Cicero, the schedule. I know what that costs, and I know what it makes me. and I'll answer to every man here for it." He looked down. "I'm not going to kill you, Julian. You'd be a story. Men would tell it for years." He leaned in slightly, and he said the last part quietly, and he said it into his cousin's left ear. "I'm going to put you in a room where nobody ever bothers listening to you again." Enzo Barone was indicted in the second week of March. It took the Northern District 6 weeks to take the rest of it apart. He came alone. That was the part she thought about afterward. That a man who hadn't crossed a sidewalk without 2 people in 11 years stood in a 14th floor corridor of the Hotel Beaumont at 4 in the afternoon, with his hands in his coat pockets, and nobody at either end of the hall. Brooklyn came around the corner, pushing the cart, and stopped. "You can't be up here," she said. "I know. Guests only. I took a room." He said it without any particular expression. 1219. "I'm told it's very nice." They stood there. Somewhere down the corridor a door closed. "Elias filed on Monday," he said. "It's out of my hands now, and there's a good chance a piece of it comes back on me eventually. I wanted you to hear that from me, and not from a newspaper." "All right. That isn't why I came." Brooklyn waited. "There's something I've owed you since Bridgeport," Jackson said. "I'm not going to explain what I said to you in that room, because there isn't an explanation that would sound like anything except an excuse. And you were owed better than that, and you didn't get it. But there's a thing you don't know, and you should have it." He looked at her. "You think I saw you for the first time that night in September?" "I know you did." "No." He shook his head slowly. "There was a hospital fundraiser at the Palmer House in March, then a thing at the Union League in May, then a wedding in Barrington in July. 400 people. Worst room I've been in 10 years. He paused. "At every one of those, sometime before I sat down, somebody had turned my chair. Not much. A few degrees. And there was a water glass set on my left when I hadn't asked for one. And once a place card moved, so a man who mumbles was on the wrong side of me from where the seating chart had him." Brooklyn didn't say anything at all. "The first time I thought it was luck. The second time I stopped believing in luck. After the third one I put people on it." His voice was quite level. 6 months, Brooklyn. I had men going through guest lists, and catering contracts, and event staff rosters, trying to find out who in this city knew. And every single one of them came back with nothing, because when they asked who was in the room, they got told who was at the tables." He stopped. "Nobody counts the servers. Not one man I employ thought to write down a single name. She had put one hand out onto the top of the cart at some point without noticing." "So no," Jackson said. "That wasn't the night I found you. That was the night you came around the head of the table and did it in front of me, and I finally got to see who it had been the whole time." And Brooklyn Novak, who hadn't cried when her mother died in a ward at Northwestern, who hadn't cried in a study in September, or on a tile floor in December, or in a room on Halsted Street with 11 stitches in her arm, put her hand over her face, and stood in a hotel corridor and wept. He didn't touch her. He waited, which was the correct thing. And it was a long moment before she got her breath back and wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked at him. "I'll come back," she said, "but there's one condition, and it isn't negotiable. Name it. Don't ever nod at me again." Her voice was raw and perfectly steady. "I've watched you do it to 100 people. If you don't hear me, say so. Everyone else in your life gets the performance. I don't want it." Jackson Vitale looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. And then, because he was a careful man and because it mattered, "Say it again." "I lost the middle of it. There's a cart running down the hall behind me." Brooklyn started to laugh, and it came out wrong and wet and half a sob. And she said it again. A year later, there was a meeting in the long room at Lake Forest. 11 men and 2 women around the table. And Jackson Vitale opened it the way he had opened every meeting for 8 months. "For anyone who hasn't sat with me before, I'm deaf in the right ear. Sit on my left. And if I ask you to repeat something, it's not because I wasn't listening." He wore a small device behind the right ear that sent what it caught across to the good side, and it had taken him 4 months to stop reaching up to check that it was hidden. Nobody laughed. Nobody ever had. The family was mostly hotels now, and property on the South Lakefront, and a linen company in Cicero that had been sold for its land. Brooklyn had started something in her mother's name, the Dorothy Novak Fund, which did one narrow thing very well, which was to buy out medical debt for hotel and restaurant workers in Cook County, and in its first year it cleared 311 people. Sienna Barone left Illinois with her family's collapse and did not come back. Whitney Ashworth married a man who has never once heard her finish a sentence. Natalia Lindquist sent a card in the spring that said only, "I played too loudly that night, and I'm sorry." There was a dinner in the long room that October, 20 people, and a young woman came around the table with a bottle and reached Brooklyn's chair. "Thank you, Camille," Brooklyn said, and the girl's head came up, because in 8 months in that house, nobody had ever used her name. Jackson stood and pulled out the empty chair beside him and said, "Sit down and eat something. You've been on your feet since noon." And the girl looked at the two of them and then sat, and the table went on talking. Here is what this story is really about. Respect isn't the courtesy we extend to the people who can do something for us. It's what we give to the ones who can't, the ones who carry our trays and clean our rooms and hold the door, the ones we have quietly agreed not to see. The world is full of people standing at the edge of our lives who notice everything about us while we notice nothing about them. And the kindness we owe them costs us nothing at all. And the day we finally look up and learn their names, something in us gets returned that we didn't know we'd lost. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you can join us for a new story every day. We'd truly love to know what this one stirred in you. Has there been a person in your own life who saw you when no one else did? Or someone you've walked past 100 times without ever asking their name? Tell us in the comments, because we read them, and because the things you write there come from a real place, and they matter to us more than we can say. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet joy.